The crisis in Venezuela is one of the most profound humanitarian, political, and economic catastrophes in modern history. The collapse of a once prosperous nation has captured the attention of the world, raising questions about the causes and consequences of this tragic situation. This analysis delves into the multifaceted nature of the Venezuelan crisis, examining its roots in economic mismanagement, political corruption, and social unrest, as well as its far-reaching consequences for the country and the international community. Historical background. Venezuela, a country rich in natural resources, particularly oil, was once one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America. During much of the 20th century, it experienced economic growth fueled by oil exports. However, its heavy dependence on oil made the economy vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. By the late 20th century, political instability, inequality, and corruption began to erode the country's economic and social fabric. The election of Hugo Chavez in 1998 marked a turning point. Chavez implemented a socialist model known as the Bolivarian Revolution, characterized by extensive state control over the economy, large-scale social programs, and an anti-imperialist stance. While his policies initially reduced poverty and improved healthcare and education, they also sowed the seeds of economic mismanagement, corruption, and authoritarianism. Economic causes of the crisis. The economic roots of Venezuela's crisis are deeply intertwined with its dependence on oil and the policies of the Chavez and Nicolas Maduro governments. Key economic factors include 1. Oil dependence. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world, but its over-reliance on oil exports made it vulnerable to price shocks. When global oil prices plummeted in 2014, Venezuela's economy, which derived more than 90% of its revenue from oil, faced a catastrophic decline in income. 2. Economic mismanagement. Chavez's nationalization of key industries, including oil production and extensive subsidies for food and fuel, created inefficiencies and corruption. Maduro exacerbated these problems by printing money to cover deficits, leading to hyperinflation. By 2020, inflation had reached an astronomical 300,000%, eroding the value of the bolivar and plunging millions into poverty. Number 3. Corruption and misallocation of resources. Rampant corruption within the government and state-owned enterprises siphoned billions of dollars away from public programs. Mismanagement of the National Oil Company, PDVSA, resulted in declining production levels, despite Venezuela's vast reserves. 4. Price controls and market distortions. The government's imposition of strict price controls on basic goods led to shortages, as producers were unable to sell goods profitably. Black markets flourished, further destabilizing the economy. 3. Political causes of the crisis. The political roots of Venezuela's crisis lie in authoritarian governance, weakened institutions, and a polarized society. 1. Authoritarianism under Chavez and Maduro. Chavez and Maduro consolidated power by weakening democratic institutions, undermining the judiciary, and suppressing opposition parties. Media censorship and political intimidation became commonplace, stifling dissent. 2. Erosion of rule of law. The government Third, political causes of the crisis. The political roots of Venezuela's crisis lie in authoritarian governance, weakened institutions, and a polarized society. 1. Authoritarianism under Chavez and Maduro. Chavez and Maduro consolidated power by weakening democratic institutions, undermining the judiciary, and suppressing opposition parties. Media censorship and political intimidation became commonplace, stifling dissent. 2. Erosion of rule of law. The government causes of the crisis. The political roots of Venezuela's crisis lie in authoritarian governance, weakened institutions, and a polarized society. 1. Authoritarianism under Chavez and Maduro. Chavez and Maduro consolidated power by weakening democratic institutions, undermining the judiciary, and suppressing opposition parties. Media censorship and political intimidation became commonplace, stifling dissent. 2. Erosion of rule of law. The government's disregard for constitutional norms and legal frameworks eroded public trust. Elections were marred by irregularities, and opposition leaders were often imprisoned or exiled. 3. Polarization and social unrest. The Venezuelan government's populist policies deepened divisions between supporters and opponents of the regime. Protests against economic hardship and political repression were met with violent crackdowns, resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of arrests. IV. Social consequences of the crisis. The humanitarian impact of the crisis has been devastating, affecting nearly every aspect of daily life in Venezuela. 1. Mass migration. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2015, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. Neighboring countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Peru have borne the brunt of this exodus, straining their resources and infrastructure. 2. Poverty and malnutrition. The collapse of the economy has left millions in extreme poverty. By 2022, nearly 95% of Venezuelans lived below the poverty line, and malnutrition, particularly among children, reached crisis levels. Food shortages and skyrocketing prices made even basic necessities unaffordable. 3. Healthcare collapse. Venezuela's once robust healthcare system has crumbled under the weight of the crisis. Hospitals lack basic supplies, medicines, and equipment, leading to preventable deaths from treatable conditions. Diseases like malaria and measles, previously under control, have resurged. 4. Education and social services. The crisis has disrupted education, with many children dropping out of school due to hunger, transportation issues, or the need to work to support their families. Social services, once a cornerstone of Chavez's policies, have been gutted by budget cuts and mismanagement. V. International consequences. The Venezuelan crisis has had significant implications beyond its borders, affecting regional stability, global geopolitics, and humanitarian efforts. 1. Regional instability. The mass migration of Venezuelans has strained the resources of neighboring countries and created tensions within the region. Border disputes, xenophobia, and crime have risen in host countries, complicating efforts to provide assistance. 2. Geopolitical rivalries. The crisis has drawn international actors into a complex web of alliances. The United States and European Union have imposed sanctions on Maduro's government, while Russia, China, and Iran have provided economic and political support. This geopolitical divide has complicated efforts to resolve the crisis. 3. Humanitarian aid challenges. Efforts to deliver humanitarian aid to Venezuela have been hindered by government restrictions and politicization of aid. The Maduro regime has often blocked international assistance, claiming it as an infringement on sovereignty. Attempts at resolution. Numerous attempts to address the Venezuelan crisis have been made, with varying degrees of success. 1. International sanctions. The US, EU, and other nations have imposed economic sanctions on Venezuelan officials and institutions, aiming to pressure the regime into political reforms. However, critics argue that sanctions have also worsened the humanitarian crisis by limiting access to resources. 2. Dialogue and mediation. Efforts by international organizations like the United Nations and regional bodies like the Organization of American States, OAS, have focused on facilitating dialogue between the government and opposition. These talks have often failed due to mistrust and intransigence on both sides. 3. Humanitarian aid efforts. Despite government resistance, international NGOs and agencies have provided food, medicine, and support to Venezuelans inside and outside the country. These efforts, however, remain insufficient to meet the scale of the crisis. SIT. Future prospects. The future of Venezuela remains uncertain. Several scenarios could unfold, depending on domestic and international dynamics. 1. Continued stalemate. If the Maduro regime remains in power without significant reforms, the crisis is likely to persist, deepening the suffering of the Venezuelan people. 2. Political transition. a negotiated transition to a more inclusive government could pave the way for economic recovery and political stability. However, achieving such a transition requires concessions from both the government and opposition. 3. International intervention. While some have called for stronger international intervention, including military action, such measures carry significant risks and could further destabilize the region. The crisis in Venezuela is a stark reminder of how economic mismanagement, political corruption, and social inequality can converge to create a devastating humanitarian disaster. While the immediate causes of the crisis lie in the policies of the Chavez and Maduro regimes, its consequences have rippled far beyond Venezuela's borders, affecting millions of lives and challenging the international community's ability to respond. Resolving the Venezuelan crisis requires a multifaceted approach, combining humanitarian aid, diplomatic efforts, and long-term economic and political reforms. The resilience and courage of the Venezuelan people, coupled with sustained international support, will be crucial in rebuilding a nation that has suffered immeasurably, but still holds the potential for recovery and renewal.